Hey, this is Koda and Jackie. Just after Christmas in 2021, I decided to use my time off work wisely and explore Sardinia in Italy for the first time. So I booked ferry tickets and my pup Koda and I drove to Livorno to catch the overnight ferry. We arrived in Golfo ARANCI early in the morning and went straight to a nearby beach. We didn't really have an itinerary, so I just made it up as we went. We came across beautiful CALA Quay, which we had pretty much to ourselves. The water looked so inviting, but it was December after all, with an average water temperature of about 15 degrees. And in addition, it was windy enough to make Koda's ears stand up, so definitely too cold to swim. We then continued south along the Strada Orientale across the Supramonte mountain range, where we discovered some amazing scenery that at times even reminded me of Hawaii, mainly because of how green everything was. We eventually got to DUNE, where Google Maps, of course, sent us along the narrow alleys in the village rather than the road around the village. It was definitely the more exciting route though. Eventually, we made it to one of the few open campsites at this time of year in TORRE di BARI. The following morning we left early-ish to drive back north via DUNE and into the mountains to go on a hike to CALA. It was a very pretty hike down the mountain to get to the beach, where we hung out for a bit and had some leftover pizza from the previous night before making the strenuous ascent back up the mountain. At least strenuous by my standards, but then again, I don't really hike all that much. And then we had another night in TORRE di BARI before heading further south the next day to check out COSTA. Our first stop was at SCOGLIO di PEPPINO, where I would definitely go back to for a nice beach afternoon on a warm day. Then we hung out at Spiaggia di Cala and enjoyed the sun for a bit and had some cuddles. The next stop was Spiaggia di PIRA, where we dipped our feet in the water and enjoyed some more sunshine. It was New Year's Eve and we stayed in a car park near SPIAGGIA di Semios. We woke up to a very overcast January morning sky, and unfortunately the weather remained that way for pretty much the rest of the trip. It was winter after all. We started 2022 with a long walk along the beach before we drove to Porto and walked up the hill to Torre di Porto, where we had a stunning view over the coast. It was still overcast, but the water looked unreal. Then we drove along the panoramic route from Kia to Teolada, where we stopped here and there to take a few pictures. It was a shame that the weather wasn't nicer, but I still got an idea of what it would be like in the spring or summer. The following day, we kept driving to check out the west coast. The weather kept getting worse, but we tried to get out of the camper in between showers and look at a few more spots, like the old mining town Nevida and Porto FLAVIA, from where we could overlook the sugar loaf of Sardinia, SCOGLIO pan di zucchero. Then on to Porto and Is Arotas, where we stayed by the beach. The initial plan was to do a full lap of the island, but due to the weather I decided to skip most of the west coast and cut across the island to get back to the east coast, where the weather seemed to be a bit less rough. So day 7 was spent driving back east to SPIAGGIA della DUNE, where Koda had the best time racing around the dunes and trying to drink up the fresh water pool at the beach. For sunset, we paid CALA another visit. The area closes at 5 PM, which we weren't aware of, so we enjoyed the sunset and having the beach all to ourselves again. When we got back to the camper, a ranger chased us away to make sure nobody sleeps at or near the beach. But because it is such a stunning bay, we came back early in the morning to see CALA in the daylight one more time. We then headed north to check out the famous Costa SMERALDA. To sum it up, I was disappointed. From the road you could tell that there were some stunning coves and beaches, but it was really difficult to find access to any of them because there were hotels and resorts everywhere. Eventually we found at least one beach that we could get to. It was even harder to find a campsite in the north of the island. But one campsite owner agreed to open his gates just for us, which I greatly appreciated. It was really windy, but the view and the sunset were so pretty. And Koda made a friend as well. And most importantly, there was a shower. The next morning we drove to Capo Testa in the far north of the island. We hiked and climbed around rocks for a bit, where we came across some interesting rock formations. The wind made Koda's ears fly again. The strangest animal in the bushes that he had ever seen. Afterwards we headed back towards the east coast and came across some of the not so pretty sides of the island. We got caught in the rain as we reached the coast in La Coletta, but we were greeted with a pretty rainbow which made up for the rain. As we headed further south, we stopped in DORGALI, where we saw another rainbow hitting the Gulf of Orose. The next morning we headed back to the coast, to CALA and started off on a hike to CALA Luna. We didn't see a single person along the way or at our destination, so we had the whole beach to ourselves. We spent the night back in TORRE di BARI, and the next morning we were greeted by a double rainbow, so the bad weather wasn't all bad. Then we left and drove to Pedra Longa, which is basically a very majestic looking tall rock in the water. From there we hiked north along the Salvaggio Blue trail until it got too steep for Koda as the path led up to Punta Girardelli. When we returned to Torre di Bari, I went to the shops while Koda made sure that no one got in the car to steal my spot. It wasn't the most challenging hike of our trip, but Koda was snoozing away as soon as we got to the campsite.
And that concluded the last night in Sardinia.
Early the next morning we made our way back to Golfo ARANCI to catch the ferry back to the mainland. When we got on the ferry, I realized that it was smaller than the first ferry and there was no seating area. So I booked us a cabin and we both got a fair bit of sleep. So what's the Sardinia verdict? Obviously I can only speak for Sardinia in the winter, but my impression was that Sardinia really has so much to offer. The scenery is just stunning and the beaches are incredibly inviting. In the summer I'm imagining the island to be very dry and hence less green. And from what I've heard and seen on Google Images, it must be super crowded as soon as the temperatures go up. As always, crowds tend to take the fun out of the experience, so I really appreciate that I got to experience Sardinia during low season, where there were hardly any tourists around. I would love to go back when it's warm enough to swim, but I don't think Koda would like the heat too much. For us, going in the winter was the perfect choice. One major flaw that I've noticed was the trash everywhere. It's sad to see how people, tourists as well as locals, simply don't seem to care about preserving the beauty of this island. But overall, I would definitely come back to explore more of Sardinia.